Good morning. I'm one of the two Sherrys, and it's my first time up in front this year, and it's always really neat for me to look out and see so many eager faces. Some of them are turning, so welcome back to all of you. And for those of you who are new, I look forward to getting to know your names and getting to know you better, and I hope you feel welcome and that this is where you're supposed to be on Wednesday mornings. So this morning, we're going to be looking at another very familiar story from the life of Moses, but I think it would be helpful to set this part of his story in some context, so that's where I'm going to start. So the book of Exodus that we're studying this fall, it often looks back to promises that God made in Genesis. Genesis, of course, tells the story of how God made the world. It tells how sin entered our world when Adam and Eve chose to disobey God. And later it tells how God entered into a covenant relationship with Abraham and his descendants with the ultimate goal of blessing and rescuing our broken world. Now in Exodus, which picks up the storyline a few hundred years from where Genesis leaves off, the story is recounted of the creation of a nation, the nation of Israel, from Abraham's descendants. And it describes how God redeemed the Jewish people, how he called them to himself to be set apart from all other nations and to be an example for all other people of how good it can be to live under God's sovereign kingship. So in Genesis, we saw the need for salvation because of the fall and because sin entered our world. And in our study of Exodus, we're going to learn that God provides salvation for his people through their faith and their obedience. The Israelites' exodus from Egypt is the historical event that initially defined the Jewish nation as God's chosen people. And Moses, of course, was the man at the center of all the miraculous events that take place. And the reason is because he's the man that God chose to use to lead his people out of slavery and into the promised land. So Moses, here's a sculpture of him. He lived to be about 120 years old, but it was only during the last 40 years of his life that he assumed the mantle of leadership for his people, first returning to Egypt to petition the new Pharaoh to let the Israelites go and leave their life of slavery, and then leading them in the Exodus in the subsequent years in which they wandered in the desert. And I think this last third of his life, how Moses is depicted here, is how we most often think of him, right? We think of him as this great man, this great leader who confronted Pharaoh, who shepherded God's people out of slavery in Egypt, and who delivered God's law to them during their years in the wilderness. But Moses wasn't born a great leader. In fact, as we now know from last week's lesson, the reason that he fled Egypt when he was around 40 was because he had tried to intervene when a Jewish slave was being beaten. And while his instinct to save one of God's people was good, Moses took matters totally into his own hands in that incident, and he ended up killing the Egyptian slave master and then having to flee Egypt to escape Pharaoh's wrath. So this first attempt by Moses to act totally on his own power to rescue an Israelite ended in failure. But God was still planning to save his people, and Moses was obviously a very big part of that plan. Now, in the beginning of the passage that we looked at for this morning, we read that when Moses first encountered God in the burning bush, he responded the same way Abraham did by saying, "Here I am." But as we know from reading the rest of the passage, unlike Abraham, who immediately responded in faith and simply obeyed God's command, which in his case was to pick up and leave everything and leave his own old life behind. Well, here with Moses, as soon as God gave him the specifics on what he wanted him to do, the more reluctant Moses became. He continued to question God and to find reasons why he couldn't do what God was calling him to. Now, the encounter that Moses had with God, seeing a visible manifestation of God in the burning bush and actually being in his presence, it's something that none of us are likely to experience here on this earth. And this burning bush that was never consumed by its own fire, it was a physical miracle that also communicated great spiritual truths about who God is. Even before God spoke and told Moses about himself, he revealed many essential things about who he is through this way that he chose to manifest himself. And like all of God's revelations about himself, Moses' encounter with him in the burning bush is designed to deepen our understanding of who God is. So, what did God reveal about himself through this bush that was on fire but never burned up? Well, he showed that he's sovereignly in control of all creation. He showed a tiny, tiny glimpse of his power and his glory that are both so immense that we can't even comprehend or even begin to imagine them. And that's why Moses couldn't even look at this manifestation of God. God also showed that he's always present with his people, and that although they may often be afflicted, that he will not allow them to be consumed. And then finally, God showed his transcendent holiness through the burning bush. And when we talk about God's holiness, we're not referring simply to his perfect righteousness, although that's certainly a part of it. God's holiness also means that he is set apart from everything that he's made, that there's an infinite distance between his deity and our humanity. And in this encounter with the burning bush, God also spoke to Moses, and he told him that he was standing on holy ground because of God's presence. And this is actually the first time that the Bible uses the word holy with reference to God. And God revealed his holiness here in a way that had never been shown before. And that's why Moses was told to take off his sandals and to keep his distance. They were both meant to be signs of respect for God's holiness. Today's passage also teaches us more about God's care and his compassion for his people and his faithfulness to his covenant promises. In both 2:24 and 3:7, we read that God heard the groaning of the Israelites. He saw their affliction, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and his descendants. And not only does God tell Moses that he's aware of the suffering of his people, but more importantly, in 3:8, God tells Moses, "So I have come down to rescue them." So not only is God's relationship with his people a personal relationship, it's a saving relationship. And here we see the central reason why God revealed himself to Moses in the burning bush. God was calling Moses to be the tool that God was going to use to end the suffering of his people. And in verse 12b, we learn what the ultimate purpose was for the deliverance of the Israelites. God was going to save his people so that they could serve and worship him. And this purpose is stated over and over throughout the book of Exodus. There's 4 verses up on the PowerPoint here, which each one happens after one of the plagues. And in every one, you can see from the sections that I put in bold, God sends Moses to Pharaoh with the exact same message. Let my people go so that they can worship me. And from these next 2 verses, you can see that Pharaoh's advisors eventually get that message and tell Pharaoh, let them go so they can worship their God. And even Pharaoh eventually gets it and says, go worship your God. And in fact, the Hebrew word for worship is the same word that's used for to be a slave. So the point is that having been slaves to the Egyptians and serving them, the Israelites were going to be saved so that they could serve God and worship him. The Israelites weren't being saved just for themselves. God wasn't going to redeem them from their slavery in Egypt simply so they could enjoy an easier life in the Promised Land. Ultimately, the Israelites were meant to go from serving Pharaoh to serving God. They were going to be saved for God and for his own glory. Now, we know that God is sovereignly in control of everything, and he could always make anything happen that he wants to. In this case, God could have rescued the Israelites by himself. He didn't need Moses. But that's not typically the way God operates. He quite often chooses to use his people to accomplish his plans. And the story of Moses and the Exodus is a great example of how God uses ordinary, flawed, and sinful people to carry out his plans. But in order for God's will to be accomplished by his people, they need to trust him and be obedient servants. And as this part of the story with Moses unfolds, we see that he can't seem to simply trust God. And as a result, for much of his initial encounter with God at the burning bush, he's not willing to obey God's call on his life. Unlike the midwives that we looked at in lesson 1, Moses seems to fear Pharaoh at this point more than he feared God. So in 3:10, God tells Moses exactly what he wants him to do. Go to Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And as soon as Moses hears this, he starts coming up with reasons why he's not the right guy for the job. In verse 11, we read the first question that Moses raised. Who am I to go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Now, on the one hand, it's easy to understand why Moses wouldn't think he was very well suited to this enormous task. I mean, remember 40 years ago when he tried to intervene to save the Jewish slave who was being beaten, his actions resulted in him having to flee Egypt. And in another incident that happened right after that, 40 years earlier, when Moses tried to intervene to stop a fight between two Jewish slaves, one of the slaves turned to him and basically said, "Who do you think you are?" Which makes it clear that Moses didn't even have the credibility at that point to settle their dispute, let alone lead the Israelites as a nation on this great journey. So it's certainly possible that this first objection that Moses raised with God, it came out of some real sense of humility and an unworthiness, a belief that he just really wasn't up to this enormous job. But this attitude also came from the mistake that Moses made of looking only to himself and his own abilities instead of looking to God and having faith that God would empower him to fulfill whatever God's plan for him was. And we can see this pretty clearly from the fact that in his objections, Moses keeps referring to himself. Who am I? Later, he'll ask God, what if they don't believe me? And later, I have never been eloquent. At this point, Moses doesn't seem to be able to trust who God is and then just move forward in faith the way that Abraham did, knowing that God's going to empower him. So in answer to Moses' objection that he couldn't possibly do this huge thing that was being asked of him, God simply says, "I will be with you." Now, God's response shows us that it didn't really matter if Moses was qualified for what he was being asked to do. That was actually totally irrelevant, which is probably why God didn't even bother to try to convince Moses that he could do what was being asked of him. Instead, God simply said, "I will be with you," by which he wanted Moses to understand that you're not going to do it. I'm going to do it through you. By telling Moses, "I will be with you," God was trying to get him to understand that Moses didn't need to accomplish this huge task that he was being given under his own power. That wasn't actually the heart of what God was asking of Moses. The core of what God was implicitly asking Moses was, "Will you trust me?" Because that's really all Moses needed to do. He needed to trust that God would accomplish his plans using Moses as his instrument, no matter how unqualified Moses felt. And God says this same thing, "I will be with you," to other leaders of the Israelites throughout the Old Testament, implicitly asking them to trust him and step out in faith. After Moses died and Joshua inherited the role of being the spiritual leader of the Israelites, this is what God tells him, "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you." To Gideon, when he was too scared to lead the troops into battle, God says, "I will be with you and you will strike down the Midianites." To the young Jeremiah, when he became a prophet, God said, "Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you." And finally, to the prophet Isaiah, God said, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God." And of course, Jesus gave us all this same promise, which Matthew recorded in 28:20b. "Behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." So getting back to our passage, the next question that Moses asked God in 3:13 is to reveal his very name. This question shows that Moses also had a lot of doubts about whether the Israelites would accept him as a leader who was divinely appointed by the God of their fathers. And we should remember that at this point, God had not revealed himself to his people for the 400 years that they had been enslaved in Egypt. So Moses wanted the full weight of divine authority behind him when he went to the Jewish elders. And some Bible scholars think that by asking this question about God's name, Moses was actually trying to better understand God's very character. Because in the ancient Middle East, names were reflective of a person's nature or character. So back then, to ask someone his name was sort of like asking them, "What kind of person are you?" Now, God progressively reveals himself throughout the Old Testament. And beginning in Genesis, we find him referred to as God, as the Lord, or as the Lord God. But chapter 3 of Exodus, our passage for today, is actually the only place in the Old Testament with an explanation of God's name. So in today's passage, when Moses asked God, "What shall I tell the Israelites when they ask the name of the God who sent me?" the answer that Moses got reveals a tremendous amount about God's divine being and his attributes. In 3:14, in answer to this question about his name, God responds, "I am who I am." Now, this is not a name like Moses or like Sherry or like one of the Nancys. It's actually a statement about the very nature of God as being self-determined and self-sustaining. "I am who I am" incorporates the ideas of uncreated, eternal, and unchangeable self-existence that's different than any other being. God is who he is in himself, and the cause of his being is in himself. All of this is contained and revealed in this one phrase, "I am who I am." And then in 3:15, God goes on to tell Moses, "Say to the Israelites that the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I'm to be remembered generation to generation." So here God is telling Moses more about himself, that he's the same God throughout the ages, and that he's the Lord, which is a term that refers to one who has power and authority. So with this name, God is also affirming his lordship over his people, as well as his absolute power over all creation. Now, if we go back to chapter 17 of Genesis, we read that the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, promising to bring blessing to all nations through him. And it's because God is faithful and because he remembered that covenant that he was commissioning Moses to lead Abraham's descendants out of bondage and into the promised land. It would be through Moses that God was going to fulfill the promises that he made to the patriarchs. He would establish a personal relationship with the Israelites as a nation. He would be their God, and they would be his people. So now we're at the point of the story where Moses has questioned God about whether he's really the right guy for the job, and he sought to understand who God is. And God has patiently answered, letting Moses know it didn't really matter whether Moses believed he was the right guy for the job, as long as God was with him. And God revealed himself as the eternal, all-powerful, sovereign Lord of all creation. Now, in the rest of chapter 3, God then gives Moses detailed instructions for carrying out his will. He tells him exactly what he should say to the Jewish elders and to Pharaoh, and he foretells that the Jewish elders will listen to Moses, but that Pharaoh will refuse to let the Israelites go until after God's power is shown through various miracles and plagues. So how does Moses respond after all of this? He continues to question whether he'll be believed, even though God already told him that the Jewish elders would listen to him. So really, the heart of Moses' objections seems to be that he doesn't trust God and believe that everything's going to go according to God's plan. And in 4:10, that becomes even more clear when Moses brings up yet another concern, this time about his speaking abilities. And I have to say, this is really sort of a lame excuse on his part because God already told him exactly what he should say. So Moses wasn't going to have to come up with eloquent speeches on his own. And God already told him that the Jewish elders were going to listen to him and believe him. So ultimately, by bringing up this speaking issue, Moses was not showing respect to God, who, after all, was fully aware of all of his strengths and all of his weaknesses because God's the one who intentionally made Moses exactly the way that he was. So in answer to this latest objection, God simply points that out. He reminds Moses that God intentionally created everyone exactly the way they are. And the underlying point is that God can use the flawed people that he's created as tools to accomplish his will if they trust him and if they obey his call on their lives. Throughout their conversation, God keeps returning to what he's called Moses to do, lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And at the end of today's passage, even though God has patiently dealt with all of his objections, in 4:13, Moses finally asks God to, could you please just send somebody else? Proving that underneath all of his excuses was a fundamental unwillingness at this point to trust and obey. So that's the story that we're told in today's passage about Moses in the burning bush. So what can we learn from this, frankly, sort of uninspiring part of Moses' life to apply to our own lives? Well, I think that despite the fact that clearly this is not Moses' finest moment, there are some important lessons for us here. One really important takeaway from this passage is that it reminds us of who God is, which is why we can trust him when we feel his calling. When we read about Moses' encounter with God in the burning bush, we're reminded that God will always be with us. We're reminded that the eternal and all-powerful creator of the entire universe loves us, and he hears our cries. We're reminded that God can intervene in situations that seem impossible to us. We're reminded that God is faithful to the covenant promises that he's made to his people. And we're reminded that we're now his people, and that he will deliver us from the sin that we're enslaved to, and that ultimately he's going to bring us to our promised land. And I think we can also see very clearly from today's passage that God wants to use as his tools broken, sinful people just like us, people who have failed in the past and people who haven't trusted him in the past. And just like Moses eventually does, when we're willing to step forward in faith and trust, we can be the instruments that God uses for his sovereign plan and for his glory, and we're going to be blessed by that. Everything that Moses learned from God when he encountered him in the burning bush are truths that we can depend on. First and foremost is knowing that God will be with us. We can also depend on knowing that God intentionally designed us exactly the way we are, with all of our faults and all of our shortcomings, as well as all of our abilities and talents, and he knows all about all of them. God can use us exactly the way he made us to accomplish his will. The fact is that our success as God's servants doesn't depend nearly as much on our abilities as it does on our trust and our obedience. We can also depend on knowing that God will equip us for his kingdom plans. We don't have to rely only on our own strength or give in to our fears of what might happen when we step out in faith. As one of the commentaries said, God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the called. we can also depend on knowing that our salvation, it's ultimately for God's glory. Remember, I said earlier that God didn't save the Israelites just to bring them to an easier life in the promised land, but instead, he saved them for his own glory. Well, that's equally true for us. God has redeemed us and saved us, not just because he loves us, although he does, but ultimately for his own glory. And what that means is that our lives are meant to be lived in a way that glorifies God and that points other people to him. And finally, we should always remember that the God who saves, he is also the God who sends. Each one of us has a part to play in growing God's kingdom, and he wants us to trust him and to step out in faith so that we can be a part of bringing his plans to fruition. God is going to accomplish his plans. The question is whether we're going to be one of the tools that he can use to do that. And I think when we're really honest with ourselves, or at least I know when I'm really honest with myself, I have to acknowledge that a lot of times I react exactly the way Moses did in this passage, when instead I should simply trust God and who he is and step out in faith. And I'm not even talking about huge things here like feeling called to start a ministry or adopt a foster child. I'm talking about something as commonplace as an interaction with somebody where I get a chance to talk about God or about my faith. Here's what often crosses my mind in those situations. The first thing I think is a combination of two of the excuses Moses gave God. Who am I? And, I'm not that eloquent. So here's how that plays out in my mind. I immediately start thinking, I'm not that good at evangelizing because when it comes right down to it, I'm not sure I'm going to do a very good job delivering the gospel message. I mean, I'm not as eloquent as Billy Graham or Brent Kunkel or Christina Levashev. The next excuse that's queued up in my head is exactly the same as another excuse Moses raised with God. What if they don't believe me? This is exactly what I get anxious about. I mean, what if the person I'm talking to doesn't believe me? Or worse yet, what if they reject me or make fun of me? Well, remember what God said to Moses? I will be with you. And I think when we hide behind excuses like not thinking we're the right person for the job or a fear of rejection, I think God's response to us is going to be exactly what he said to Moses. I will be with you. So going back to my scenario, if I get the opportunity to share my faith, the fact that I'm not as eloquent as Billy Graham actually doesn't matter. The fact that the person might reject me or even make fun of me, that actually doesn't matter either. I'm not responsible for that other person's salvation. That's up to God. If God chooses to open that person's eyes, then they're going to come to faith. In this scenario, my part is simply to be willing to trust God and to share what I know to be true in order to help grow his kingdom. We need to always remember that the God who saves is the God who sends. And God is calling each one of us, each lady who's sitting here this morning, is being called to trust God and to be willing to step out of our comfort zones and help his kingdom to grow and his will to be done. Now, what that might look like for each one of us is going to be very different. For some of us, it could be through starting a ministry or going on a mission trip. For others of us, it could be more in the way we approach our daily lives at home or at work. Or maybe it is simply being more willing to engage other people when opportunities come up to share our faith. God's call to serve him is going to play out differently in each one of our lives. But because we've been redeemed and because we're now his people, he is calling us to serve him. And when we get to the end of our lives, I really don't think God's going to hold us to account for all of those times when we stepped out in faith but saw no apparent result, whether that was in the context of sharing our faith or anything else. But what he may call us to account for is if we never really tried. If we were always saying to God what Moses did at the end of today's passage, Oh Lord, please send somebody else. So let's close together in prayer. Father God, thank you for all the truths that you make known to us through this passage. And please help us to remember everything that you taught Moses in the passage that we study for today. Trust in who you are. Trust that despite our flaws and the ways in which we don't think we're capable, that you will equip us for your kingdom plans. And help us to remember that the God who saves is the God who sends. And help us to be willing to step out of our comfort zones and to serve you, to help grow your kingdom. I ask these things in your Son's name.